Hello and welcome to this new blog post where we will talk about the new Dynamics 365 OCR invoice scanning functionality, but with a special environmental perspective. So what is this new functionality? Well, if you have not seen the new invoice capture or OCR invoice scanning feature, how I call it, then have a look at this tech talk that was published a couple of months before. And if you open this link, then you will find a PowerPoint presentation where you find the following graphics. And those graphics, they nicely describe what this tool is doing. It's basically a model-driven app that gets invoices, for example, from Microsoft Outlook, from a shared drive, from a portal or whatever, and then uses Power Platform tools and the Microsoft AI Builder to read the information from the vendor invoice. The last step is then, of course, once you have all of the invoice information, that you process and post the invoice in Dynamics or another ERP system. The next slide is also from the PowerPoint that I mentioned, and it shows a bit more details of what kind of technology is used. But what I want to do now is just take a step back and think about what are we doing with this tool, and is this the right one, or is there something else? And what I found is that the technology, not artificial intelligence, but this OCR technology was actually kind of invented or first used 50 years ago. And it was basically used by Raymond Kurzweil. And he wanted to use it for blind people so that they can read documents, papers. And that a computer is reading these identified words and texts for them. And this made me thinking, hey, why are we using a 50-year-old technology that was actually made for blind people to process documents? And isn't there something smarter or better? And then I came up with the idea, okay, let's do a one-to-one comparison of the artificial intelligence / OCR invoice scanning feature that was presented in the tech talk and that is also illustrated in this graphic here, versus electronic invoices, or what we call X-invoices. The German term is X-Rechnung. So let's see and compare them. And the starting point for this comparison is, of course, an email that we receive. And in the first case, with the OCR technology, we receive an email, typically with a PDF document. In the second case, we receive also an email, but this time with an XML document. So there's actually not a big difference. But let's go one step further and have a look at the different steps that we execute. So for the transmission of the invoice, we saw that, well, except for the attachment, there is not a big difference. So what I investigated is how much is the CO2 footprint for an email with an attachment. And I found a couple of studies that I will show later, where they say, okay, between 0.3 and 50 grams of CO2 emissions. And the more recent papers say around 10 to 15. Then I said, okay, let's make an assumption for the PDF attachment, which is typically a bit larger. We take 12.5 grams and 10 grams for the email with the X invoice or electronic invoice attached. So not a big difference. The big difference comes here when it comes to the processing of the invoice. Why? Because if we use artificial intelligence or OCR technologies, we need to use more advanced tools. While on the other hand side, if I use the X invoice feature, I don't need anything special. Why? Because this X invoice has a special structure that is defined by standard setters, European Union, for example, and I just need to set up this import framework once. That tells me, okay, where can I find the invoice header? Where can I find the vendor information number? Where can I find the pricing information and so on? So it's a one-time setup and mapping exercise that you have to do versus something that continuously needs kind of energy. But then the question is, how much energy is actually used if we use these artificial intelligence or OCR tools? And that's not as easy as it sounds, because there are two parts included in that. And the first part is the energy that is needed for training this artificial intelligence / OCR model. The second part is, of course, the energy consumption for using the model. But let's have a look at the first one. And here I found a couple of documents, and one had this nice graphic. It was a study that was training artificial intelligence models that were extracting information from documents. And they used different technologies, different complexities, different models. And what I left out was the very small ones. Why? Because I said, okay, we are talking about vendor invoices, which are complex and not that easy. So these things here, they are probably not applicable to our case. So if I just focus on the models that are in the highlighted yellow section, then I come up with a range of 1000 gram CO2 emissions. So here is the 1K, 1000, and this is grams, to around 10 million grams of CO2 emissions. And it's a logarithmic scale here. So in other words, there's a big range of CO2 emissions depending on the model, depending on the area, depending on the configuration of the model. And then, of course, what they did in this study was, okay, they trained the model, they kind of used it, but all from a clinical or scientific perspective. And what Microsoft is, or other vendors are doing, is they typically pre-train models, provide them to you, and you train it again with your specific invoice data from your vendors. And just as a comparison, so that you get an idea, what is this range meaning? If you know ChatGPT-3, training this large model took around 550 tons of CO2 emissions. And here are some of the references that I use for that. So what did I say then? Well, I said, okay, vendor invoices are not that easy. Typically, they are sometimes a bit complex when they have a number of pages included, when they have probably some kind of tables, price, item, quantity information. So I assumed, okay, let's go and assume that we use 10 tons of CO2 once a year to retrain or train the model. Of course, you can halve that, but you will see later on that the result will not change much. And then the energy consumption for using the model, there are also papers that say it's between 60 and 90% of the original training. So if you consume 10 tons for the original training, then I assumed, okay, 70% of that is 7 tons. Also here are some references. And then let's go on with our exercise. In the last part, we are doing the accounting for the invoice, and here I said, okay, there is not a difference. Once you have all the invoice information, then you just enter them in Dynamics and then you post them basically. So there's not a big difference. And if we summarize all of these things, then I come up with this. So first for the OCR invoice scanning solution, I said, okay, 10 tons and 7 tons for using the model, so training and using. And then I said 12.5 grams for the transmission of the invoice. If I assume 100,000 invoices per year for a pretty, let's say, small to medium-sized company, then I end up with 18.25 tons or 18,250 kilograms that I consume for one single year. Or broken down to a single invoice here, 0.18 kilograms. Now, if we look at the second option, this electronic invoice, then there is no training needed and there is no using of any artificial intelligence. Why? Because the structure is clear, the structure is defined, and there is no specific energy consumption that you need except from importing the invoice. But that's also something we have here. You need to import the invoice document to this OCR app, so to this model-driven app in the case of Dynamics. And there's actually nothing that is comparable to this. So if I assume that the invoice attachment is a bit smaller, with the same number of invoices, you have a much larger, much smaller CO2 footprint if you use this e-invoice. So the difference in my case is 17,250 kilo, and this is approximately equivalent to 86,000 kilometers drive with a typical German car, or the annual CO2 footprint of 2 typical Germans. Well, is that much? Well, as a summary, if we assume this 17,000 kilograms, and we assume that we have 70,000 mid-sized companies that can save this kind of energy or CO2. And if we say, okay, from the 70,000 companies, only 10% are actually applying this. So 10% or 7,000 companies basically move from an artificial intelligence model to an e-invoice model. Then we can save this amount of CO2. These are tons, more than 120,000 tons of CO2. Of course, I mean, that's based on an assumption. So if you say, okay, it's only 5%, then this will be less. But still, moving away from using sophisticated artificial intelligence tool to a very simple exchange of basically flat files in an XML format saves energy. And that's something you should take into consideration. Of course, it does not make a big difference if you look at a single company. But if you look at a whole country or region, and even if only a small fraction of these companies only adjust this, then it can make a big difference. Will it save the planet? Well, probably not, if you use it alone. But this is an example where even accountants or back office people can make a positive footprint towards a more sustainable environment. And don't forget, Dynamics 365 and other ERP tools, other IT tools, they typically ship with out-of-the-box e-invoicing features. So it might be really worthwhile investigating into that. And I know of not many vendors currently offer or use e-invoices or electronic invoices, at least in my home country. But it is worth giving this a try and chasing them more to get electronic invoices. Rather than spending money for a marketing campaign or for a green campaign or something else. That's something that might take you a bit longer, but chasing your vendors and asking them to provide you electronic invoices rather than old traditional PDF documents that we scan with a 50-year-old technology might be much smarter and better. So my ask again for you, don't try to become a simple computer IT wizard, because that's no longer sufficient. You must become somebody who has also an environmental sustainable mindset to help your customers, to help your company moving towards a more circular and sustainable way of doing business. Okay, that's all for today. As usual, if you have comments, other examples, please put it in the comment section or send me an email here. So thanks a lot, and then looking forward to seeing you in the next post.